Okay, good morning, everyone, or maybe if you are joining us from overseas, good afternoon. This is the second session of our Peace Week of the fall 2022. Peace Week become a tradition in our school, which bring more and more people across the globe to see what Carter School and our collaboration have to add to peace studies, to conflict resolution studies. So we are very proud of this activity which our school do in collaboration between all faculty, all students, and also our great collaborators across the globe. So today's session is devoted to research which we as a research team started together and supported by National Science Foundation. So I will start speaking a little bit about myself, and then I will ask all members of the team introduce themselves before we will go into joint presentation. We will go back and forth during this presentation because it's really collaboration where it's a collective product of all of us thinking together, working together on every stage of the project. So my name is Karina Korostelina. I'm originally from Crimea, Ukraine, and I got my both PhDs in Ukraine, both of them in psychology and social psychology. And I'm a full professor at the Carter School for Conflict Analysis Resolution, and my research connects to social identity conflicts, including civilian devastation with my co-author who is here, Daniel Rosbert. We've done a lot of work on that, including resilience, including role of history and memory, but majority of it is related to conflict dynamics. And one of the regions which I've done a lot of work is Ukraine, and I started working in Crimea first, and then a lot of my research were in Ukraine. So I'm glad that we were able, unfortunately in this time, but we were able to bring new research to you. Thank you very much. Gerard?
Hi, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Dr. Gerard Toll. I'm a professor in the School of Public International Affairs at Virginia Tech, also located in Arlington. And I would like to thank in particular Professor Susan Allen, who was quite instrumental in bringing together Karina and I, and actually all of the folks associated with the Carter School and bringing us together to help launch this particular project. I'm originally from Ulster, which is, part of the northern part of Ireland, which is in the Republic of Ireland. And that is quite relevant to this particular research because we're looking at, in part, questions concerning territorial contestation and feelings and perceptions of that. I am a political geographer by training. And the author of a number of books, including a co-authored book on Bosnia called Bosnia Remade, and then this particular book, which came out a number of years ago and is now available on audiobook. It's called Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the Contest over Ukraine and the Caucasus. So I've done research on public opinion in the post-Soviet states, the borderland states of the Russian Federation for quite a number of years, more than a decade, with a series of collaborators, most especially Dr. John O'Loughlin in the Department of Geography at the University of Colorado. So I'll leave it there. Mike?
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Swigert. I'm a PhD candidate at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And I also work as one of the graduate research assistants in this project. A lot of my current research and also my background have been focused on Eastern Europe, Particularly the Balkans currently is my focus, but I've also had some previous study and work experience in Eastern Europe, in particular, and particularly in Russia. So I was, really excited to be able to be involved in this project, and I'm excited to share with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you. Emina?
Hi, everyone. I'm Emina Muzafferia. I'm Dr. Toll's research assistant, and I'm a PhD student at Virginia Tech, just started my second year. I'm originally from Bosnia, and I did research in Bosnia for my undergrad and my master's thesis, and I previously worked for the UN Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
Thank you very much. So I will start sharing the screen. And we'll go one by one. So as you know, this event devoted to the war in Ukraine, which started in February 2022, and which take as a toll of thousands of lives, internally displaced people, people who are refugees and now residing in Poland, Germany, and other shelters. As you know, first invasion started in 2014, which created two separatist republics in Donbass, and they were low-intensity warfare between April 14 and 2022. OSCE reported casualties basically every day. People were killed or injured during these years. And then new invasion, mass invasion started in February. The position of the Russia is change of regime, idea that Ukraine is under control of the West and need to be liberated, and Ukrainian identity should be shaped to bring back Russian foundation of it. So it's denial of the Ukrainian unique identity, and also territorial consolidation of the land bridge, as you see on this map, between Russia and Crimea. And also we see a lot of reports of forced Russification of occupied territories, the denial of Ukrainian language as a language in schools, harassment of people who speak Ukrainian, change all signs, and so on. We see a lot of destruction of cultural property, which is also a big issue which we can discuss in a different place, but also very important. And as Gerard put very well, neutralizing geopolitically Ukraine. So we were able to get, thank you again, as Gerard told, thanks for Susan Allen and Chris Mitchell. We came together as a group to analyze possible responses, and during this meeting, Gerard and we talk about possible new ways how to exploit, more creative ways, how you study position of people, perception of the war. So we applied for rapid grant and got it from National Science Foundation. The idea of the grant to explore position of the people, their perception of war and peace. And project include two methodologies: survey, which we will be speaking about today, preliminary results, and focus interviews that will be conducted over fall and winter. And we will put together these two results in a mixed method approach. So there are three theoretical foundations, which we go very, very quickly about. First is studies how war experience shape attitudes toward peace agreement. And first of all, we found there are no consensus. For example, study in Colombia shows that exposure to violence increased support for peace, while in other places we found they are not strongly correlated. Another study found that previous experience has no connection to general attitude to peace. And secondly, not just no consensus, there are also different evidence about effect of exposure to peace. Some studies show that exposure to violence, insecurity lead to negative perceptions toward peace, while others show that people who more affected by violence are more able and more willing to support peace agreement. This is a first important puzzle which we addressed. And a second puzzle, which was perception of threat and is important for shaping attitudes. We see that threat as powerful predictor of intergroup prejudice and behavior. We concentrate on different types of threat, realistic, symbolic, moral threat, threat to boundaries, and others. And we also see different predictors of the threat. There are a lot of research which shows that group boundaries function as predictor, but there are also evidence not consistent between social boundary. We also introduce moral boundary, which we developed together with Daniel Rosbart in our study of collective axiology. And we also bring ideas how different emotions function within the threat perceptions. And finally, the new development, which Mike and me were working for the last several years, is normative production of threat and group differentiation, how social norms. So this theoretical puzzles also strongly introduced into this space. Jared?
Yes, so as a geographer, and as a student of nationalism, I brought a series of research questions and literatures to this. And in essence, what I was interested in was the ways in which states which produce territorial feeling in their citizens, and the map of the state becomes a sort of a logo, an identifier of it. And so there's a deep spatial socialization of the of populations. And what happens when, in conditions of war, states lose territories? And there are very, very bitter disputes over territories. Territory is often produced as indivisible by states and by nationalist narratives. How that occurs and the ways in which that negotiates territories which have multiple territories and have hybrid identities and have complex histories is a research question within the study of territorial identity. I'm particularly interested also in lost territories. There's in part one of the questions that informs this research is, how do people deal with a kind of fundamental contradiction in social life between, on the one hand, scarce resources, power realities pressing in on them, and their sacred commitments to certain things, including possibly territory. And so the research questions come out of that. Do people have irrational attachments to place? How do people deal with territorial loss and territorial loss aversion in particular? And this is particularly relevant in the case of Ireland and also in the case of Ukraine, where you have particular territories which are a large part of the population feels belongs to them and have been lost to them. So this idea of lost territories. And then what is the power of territorial appeals to people who actually may live very far from the places that are under contestation? Certain places become rendered as sacred by nationalist narratives. You're thinking of Kosovo, and then you also think of Crimea too. And what does this do to how people understand this, and whether they're willing to trade territory? And in many instances, if territory becomes sacred, any notion of trading it is taboo. The territory is seen as indivisible, and anyone who would propose propose that is therefore violating a moral norm, a moral commitment. So that is one of the questions that I brought to this. But of course, people have other sacred values to religion, to family, to community, and also potentially to the earth. So there is, how do they rank notions of sacred values? How does territory rank relative to others? So those are some of the questions that I brought to this research.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking a bit today about the methodology for our study. So as Dr. Korostelina mentioned, there are two main parts to this methodology. There's a survey, and then a second stage will feature focus group discussions. So all we've done so far is the survey. So I will be talking about the methodology for that. And trying to give a little bit of the details so that you all can get a sense of the type of data that we have here. So generally what we did was we surveyed around 1,800 people, both and this included both local residents and internally displaced persons living in 3 cities of Eastern Ukraine that are close to the front lines of the war. So the 3 cities are Dnipro, Poltava, and Zaporizhia. And so all of the data that we collected here, all the data collection was carried out by our colleagues at the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, and data collection took place in July 2022. And so you can see here that we have roughly 600 people who we surveyed across these 3 cities, and the samples in each city are split roughly evenly between IDPs and local residents. And so as the others have mentioned so far, a key part of this project is to understand how people's wartime experiences affect their views toward a potential peace agreement or their orientation towards peace. And so we wanted to, as being displaced is an unfortunate consequence of conflict in general, and specifically this conflict, we wanted to make sure that we were able to capture the views of people who have been displaced by the war. Next slide. And so I'll talk a little bit about the survey instrument that we use. So we developed a questionnaire for 30-minute survey interviews in English within our team, but also we consulted heavily with or closely with our colleagues at KIES, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, to make sure that the survey was locally responsive. And then we worked with our colleagues to translate the questionnaire into both Ukrainian and Russian, because we wanted to make sure that people had the opportunity to take the survey in whichever language they felt most comfortable with. And after developing the survey, our KIES conducted a pretest among a small group of respondents to gather their feedback on the survey and try to basically iron out any wrinkles or things that were difficult to understand within the survey. And then we used those results to finalize the survey before going into full data collection. And so I'll talk here a little bit about the sampling and the data collection procedures. So generally we conducted, or KIES conducted, face-to-face computer-assisted personal interviews that were roughly 30 minutes each, computer-assisted meaning basically they use tablets. And so there was a multi-stage kind of dual-pronged sampling approach that was used for this. So what part of it was focused on, there were basically slightly separate but overlapping sampling strategies used for local residents and IDPs. So for local residents, there was a fairly standard approach used where electoral precincts were used as the primary sampling unit. So 90 electoral precincts were selected for the first stage of the sampling. And then basically there was a random systematic selection of households and respondents that were selected from within those 90 electoral precincts. And for the IDPs, basically there were some IDPs who were selected from within these 53 of these electoral precincts that were used for the local resident sampling. And then there were an additional 107 specialized locations at which 84% of the IDP respondents were identified. So the purpose of this was to try to make sure that the data could be collected from places where IDPs were present. And so here are just some general statistics or descriptive statistics about our sample. And so these, I will note, have been adjusted. So we calculated survey weights to try to help make these our data relatively as representative as possible of the 3 cities. So there were weights that were used to adjust data for gender and age, group of local residents in each city, and also the ratio of residents and IDPs in each city, and also the population ratio between cities. We can just take a kind of quick look at the numbers here. So we can see that even with these adjustments, we do have overrepresentation of women compared to men in the sample. So about 57% of women compared to about 43% of men. In terms of age, we had a bit of clustering in the kind of middle age range. The lowest representation of younger people between 18 and 29 years old. In terms of education, the most common categories people selected were secondary education or technical, and also higher university degrees. And what's really important is to look at the characteristics in terms of nationality, citizenship, and language. So in Ukraine, there's in many cases, you might assume that language is always associated with people's national or ethnic identity, the language they use, but in Ukraine, there's more of a complex picture, particularly in Eastern Ukraine. So in terms of nationality, we have 90% of people who selected they identify as having Ukrainian nationality, and around 5% who selected Russian. In terms of citizenship, it's similar. 99.5% said Ukrainian, so overwhelmingly Ukrainian, and then 0.3% selected other Russian, and then a few others selected other, very small proportion. But in terms of language, actually, most of our respondents, 58.2% selected that they generally speak in Russian, 26% said that they use Ukrainian, and then 15% said they use a mix of Ukrainian and Russian, most commonly at home in terms of the language. And but then when it came to the native language that people selected, they chose 60%. So it's, and you can see even some interesting insights here in terms of the disconnect between the languages that people select as their native language, what they actually typically use, and also their selected nationality and citizenship. And I'll just talk briefly about the analytical procedures we've used. So mostly what we've done so far and what will be presented today is a more descriptive analysis of the responses that people gave. So basically the direct data that we received from the respondents. And we are continuing to work on more complex statistical analyses of the data. So things like regression and also latent class analysis to see how different latent groups of people are responding to the questions. But as we've started to do some preliminary analyses here, but we are currently working to diagnose and also address some common challenges to analyzing these fairly large complex survey data sets, but particularly challenges that often arise in conflict contexts. So for example, as you know, we've been serving people about a sensitive topic in the middle of a very difficult experience for them in relation to the questions that we were asking them. So we have, particularly for some sensitive more sensitive questions, we had a fairly high amount of missing data, which creates complexities or difficulties for the statistical analysis. So we're currently working to really explore and diagnose some of these types of challenges to make sure that we can produce the least biased kind of estimates or analyses as possible.
So we will present our results according to these 3 major theoretical puzzles. Again, as we stressed, it's at very, very first stages. We mostly represent in first preliminary analysis, and we will be happy to speak more and more about these results as we develop them. So the first important for us to see how it will affect everyday life of these people who live in front lines. And 60% of people in Dnipro and Zaporizhia stated they affected by constant shelling. 15% told that there is a lack of adequate shelter or their inability to reach the shelter. We also found that 88% of people see that Russian invasion makes them concerned about their own life. And it's definitely different for those who are internally displaced, 92% versus 86%. And also around 35% of our IDPs in our survey reported destruction of their properties and injury for immediate family member. Then we explore exposure for direct physical violence. We found that 33% of people stated that their friend or neighbor was injured in the war. 23% stated that they know a friend neighbor who was killed, have been killed. And of course, these numbers were higher for IDPs. 40% of those who know somebody who injured, and 33% of those who know somebody who has been killed in this military actions, mostly from Mariupol. While, of course, this exposure to violence brought us to findings, which people, then we ask them what are top goals for their country after the war. More than half of people selected prosperous and peaceful state. And then, of course, the second two important factors were strong military, importance to defend territory, sovereignty of the state, and also full control over the territory. These three factors create this idea how Ukraine perceives itself as a peaceful state, was able to defend itself, making its own decision, and having full territory control. For us, we saw a lot of, we also asked these questions in our survey, and we saw a lot of other survey which come to ask people direct questions. Do you want, do you need to protect territory? Do we need to protect Ukraine? And it's easy, what we found, it's easy for people to answer this patriotic question. Of course, they will answer yes. So our project was specifically, survey was specifically designed to bring deeper dilemmas of the war. So we asked people, what is more important, save lives of Ukrainian soldiers, civilians, or continue to free Ukrainian territories? And what we found that answers were distributed pretty fairly between two options. But what was the most important for us to understand is that, so we see a lot of people telling that it's very important to save lives of Ukrainian soldiers. Many people agree that it's very important to free Ukrainian territories. And also we see people around 35% who agree with both options. But what was important for our specific puzzle, theoretical puzzle, that across all three cities, IDPs, those who have a stronger exposure to violence, as you saw before in previous slides, they place saving lives over territorial liberation more than local residents. And difference is pretty significant. Again, we're working now on statistical analysis to show how experience through the experience of war impacts this perception, but even first preliminary analysis show very significant difference. Similarly, when we ask people about, is it imperative to seek ceasefire to stop killing Russians, to stop Russians from killing Ukrainian young men, we also found that a lot of people agree. An agreement, if you see here, the darker colors are IDPs, you see how strong difference between those who exposed to violence, those who lost people around them, and in comparison with people residents of the city. So so far our hypothesis that exposure to violence actually increase perception of peace so far is supported. We also ask people, especially if this is very relevant because of the discovery of the mass graves in Bucha now in Izum, how people see what is important for them. Do they prefer reparation for war crimes committed of Russia or full cooperation of Russia with the UN International Tribunal investigation on war crimes? And we see that 40% of people prefer full investigation. They want to bring justice to perpetrators of violence, while 27% prefer reparation and 27% see these two options as equal. And finally, we were very interested to see how people perceive message, what is important in terms of the messaging for people, how they see the ceasefire. And we conducted a special survey experiment. Then people were divided randomly into 3 groups and assigned 3 different conditions. One had question, how much do you support negotiation with Russia to complete ceasefire in the war? Second group had prologue by Zelensky, which told Zelensky support this, and third one was prologue by European Union and European Union leaders and US leaders. What we found that if Zelensky was a messenger, it was a stronger support for ceasefire in the war. And interestingly, that support for ceasefire negotiation decreased a little bit when European Union and US leaders were introduced as outside factor. Again, it supported theoretical ideas that in-group messenger and group leader is more important than out-group leaders. And it's also created this position of understanding how we can develop future negotiation. And second part very quickly, so we analyzing of the threat as the factor in conflict dynamics require more sophisticated statistical analysis. So what we've done so far is analyzing social boundary as a very important predictor or moderator of the social mediator of social boundary and of threat. So what we found, first of all, there is a strong social boundary between nations. Russian and Ukrainian see as completely different nations, which was not surprisingly. But what was interesting that symbolic boundary, it's a boundary about related to culture, shared visions. We found that the boundary is not as strong as we could see during the war. Again, because a lot of our respondents speak Russian language, belong to Russian cultural space as a language space, not as a nation, of course. So we see that some agreement, we see agreement among our respondents, especially about IDPs, because they came from occupied territories which are closer to Russia, that the Ukraine and Russia have some similar cultures. What was really interesting for us to find that moral boundary become a dominant one. And it's not only in how people feel about differences between Russian and Ukrainian people, but also what are normative production of moral difference. So the collective axiology really become strong factor in producing perception of the Russia, and this prevalence of moral boundary, if you see people strongly disagree that Russians are equally moral, and they also see that Ukrainian people are spiritually stronger than Russian people, both in their own perception, but also how they see developing norms in society. And finally, we use interesting tool. We ask people to measure emotions toward Russian leadership, Russian military, Russian population, and population of self-proclaimed republics. So it helps us to actually see if there are also boundary between within the Russian, if people really distinguish between Russian leadership and Russian people, Russian military and Russian leadership. And what we found that there is while there are very strong negative emotions toward Russia, but there is still distinguishing between leadership and military from general Russian population. Also, we found some slightly negative perception more than Russian population toward people living in self-proclaimed republics. Strongest emotions were disgust, anger, and hatred. We also saw some anxiety and fear, but they were less important. And this again, within each of these emotions, there was strong difference between perception of Russian leadership and Russian people. And unfortunately, we didn't find very strong difference between Russian leadership and military. So it's we're still doing the perception, but still more negative was perceived Russian leadership than military. And finally, we didn't find any significant positive emotions that were barely expressed. And Gerard?
Yes, so in relationship to territory and sacred value, one of the first research questions was to establish what are the sacred values the respondents would identify in an open question. This graph is extremely difficult to see, so I'm just putting it up here for purely illustrative purposes to show that more than anything else, the family and self dominate when you ask about sacred values. And then coming in second place is this idea, well, second, third place, there's a series of other values which come much behind, one of which is Ukraine's territorial integrity. Another one is the independence of Ukraine and defending the nation from invasion. So these are important sacred values, but they are secondary to family and self. And so that there is also important. Another one that is expressed here, which makes perfect sense given the particular nature of the sample here, is the right of people to return to their homes. So that is also important. Okay, so next slide. So therefore, what does this mean? When we ask people, first and most, we should be concerned about our own lives and well-being, not questions of territory or geopolitics. And so that's a sort of leading question. And as you can see, the really the way that the results, the distribution of results show just how divided that question is. When you ask about territory and geopolitics and those kind of things, they are important, but lives and well-being are very much in contestation with them. And so you can see the distribution there, which shows us just what a competition there is between those two. Okay, next slide. And then what we did is basically tapping into the literature on sacred values versus secular values. And the literature suggests that when you propose a trade to something that is sacred, there will be a blowback effect. In other words, most people will recoil and see it as taboo if you offer them certain amount of money for a territory. And in that sense, what we wanted to do was to ask a question like that. So we asked in one of these dilemma questions that we posed to people, what's more important, to receive economic restitution as a result of a peace negotiation or to preserve the territorial integrity of Ukraine? And as you can see, number 2 is the one that wins out here. So that affirms the sort of the presumption in the literature that this is a taboo trade, and therefore people would reject ostensibly money when you offer it relative to territory. So that is to be expected. But, and we go to the next slide. When you ask, and this is also coming out of the literature on taboo trade-offs and the potential ways in which peace negotiations can be advanced through symbolic apologies by particular parties after war. When we posed symbolic apology to the financial here, which is more important, as you can see, financial compensation for the damage caused by invasion wins out. And that is somewhat counterintuitive in that there's at least support for the idea that symbolic gestures are really, really important. But I wanted to put this slide in here to show that just because people are rejecting as taboo a trade-off between money and restitution and financial support versus territory, that doesn't mean it's not important. It is extremely important, financial compensation for the damage caused by invasion, and that is underscored by this particular finding. Okay. So that is, just a flavor of some of the particular findings that we have here. As Mike and Karina have already underscored, there is quite a bit of analysis to be done on this. And also bear in mind that this is just the first phase of this research. We also hope to do focus groups to really probe the nature of these particular dilemmas. We're aware that when you're asking in a wartime situation, which is extremely polarized and people have been affected by, intimately affected by violence, that there is a desire to sort of rally around the flag, affirm your loyalty to the cause of your state and your country. And so therefore, the openness to territorial compromise and the like is not there by and large. But as we showed with some other research findings which have been just published, there's actually differences between the attitude towards the Donbass versus the attitudes toward Crimea. So let me stop there. But just to note that this research has been published initially, one version of it in the Monkey Cage blog of the Washington Post. There was a piece in The Conversation last Friday, which was published. And today, quite a bit of the research was published in French and in Spanish on a website called Le Grand Continent, which you can get. And an English version of that research is going to be published fairly soon this week.
Yeah, I just put in the chat of this links to these three publications. Okay, I think we now open for questions, suggestions, and we will be really happy to hear from all our guests today. Mike, would you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So if you're interested to ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Susan.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you all for this research. I feel like what you're doing is very important, both in a scholarly way and also in a practical way. So I wanted to ask you if you could speak a bit to what would you advise those who are trying to end the war. What would you advise them based on your research? What is possible if we look forward in the coming months? We've got the military strategies that people are working on. Are there any other strategies you can suggest to complement the ongoing fighting? What's your suggestion coming out of your research?
And so
I can start. Yeah, I can start very quickly. And then because we discuss it a lot, so our main goal is to see what to do the right moment for negotiation is there. And as multiple research was just asked direct questions in the war, mislead how people really think about the war. I think with our methodology, we were able to show complexity and dilemmas of the war, and we're able to show what people prefer that peace negotiation in there, and how much do they want peace. And also it was very important to understand that any peace agreement is not a concession. Peace agreement doesn't mean something opposite to victory. Peace agreement means very profound, very complex process, which start on all levels of society. And I believe our results give a way for civic society, for political leaders. Thanks for Gerard, we publish and very, very widely, especially very great that we were even reaching French and Spanish speaking groups. So I think we really given ideas how to, in addition to very, very important military victories, how also peace process can be established.
Anything more to add, or should we?
Yeah, I'll hold off. We can get a series of different questions and then come back to that.
Yeah, do we want to maybe collect a couple of questions, or right now yeah, sounds good. So Dan, you're up next.
Congratulations on this study, the importance of which cannot be overstated, as Karina identified. The world is so bombarded with a militaristic framing of the war, which tends to ignore the complexity of public opinion, as you've demonstrated. Do you have a sense, and this may go beyond the immediate objectives of your study, do you have a sense of the public opinion of Zelensky himself? Because we are basically hearing of his very strong militaristic framing of the war, with occasional references to peace building. Do the people who you study have a positive or negative, or what is their impression of Zelensky in general regarding the war?
Looks like we don't have any other questions now, so maybe we can just go ahead with answering that one. Oh, Elizaveta, you take your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. It is very interesting. And I was wondering about the samples of the internally displaced persons. So is there a difference, or have you tried to establish it between the origin, the regions where they're coming from, and also maybe between the local residents of the regions? Because what I have noticed is that there is a highest difference between the responses from the residents and the IDPs in Poltava region. So maybe it's also due to some difference in the samples and where the people are coming from as compared to the responses by the IDPs and the locals in the Dnipro region. So I thought it was interesting. And then whether you sort of doing this kind of research also in the western parts of the country. So I would think that there should be even higher differences between the IDPs and the locals there, and that in general this regional difference is so seen even between the three regions that you took and which are located close to each other. Yeah, and yes, thank you very much.
Great. Karina and Gerard, do you want to go ahead and respond to those questions?
Let Gerard to start first. And
Sure. So on the issue of the policy implications and the question concerning Zelensky, I mean, one of the policy implications of at least that experiment that we did is just how significant and how powerful Zelensky's role is as an endorser of a potential path towards negotiations. So therefore, choosing that particular moment, that's a fundamental question in this war. He will move people by his particular decision for when to go to negotiations, and also move people as to what compromises to potentially consider. However, right now, Zelensky is, as you note, Dan, articulating policy positions which appear very, very strident, very uncompromising. And, you know, we can lean in his direction with some empathy because, you know, what is happening is, is sort of beyond the pale in so many ways. It is infuriating, it is outrageous, it is, as he points out, it's more than war, it's terrorism and the like. And so it's extremely difficult to deal with that particular situation. And so as the voice of the nation, as a voice of outrage, as the voice of Ukrainian victimhood, he is articulating a very, very widespread sentiment. It's difficult for him, however, when he moves for peace, because there will be, I would think, a considerable portion of people who will see peace only as victory. And he has articulated that, but if you listen closely to his talk, he actually does have a differentiated understanding of the territories. And I'm sure that's a conflict within the government right now between those who say, yes, we're going to take back Crimea, we're going to take back the Donbass, and those who are perhaps questioning of that. And we've already seen a bit of that. So policy implication, Zelensky's framing, you can look at it in a positive way, which is, you know, you need a Nixon to go to China. You need someone who articulates a very hard line in order to be able to then make a compromise. And, you know, we will see how that unfolds. IDPs versus residents, great question. I wrote a book on displacement in Bosnia and the effort by the international community to get people back to their homes. Yeah, the experience of IDPs is very, very different and really worth paying attention to. They're an important constituency in Ukraine. And, you know, this war has been so destabilizing to Ukraine as a country, as a set of communities, that, you know, there's a mixing up of the country, and the implications of that are still ongoing. Now, there were, I know from my own research in Bosnia, there were tensions between local residents and IDPs in communities, but, you know, there's also this overwhelming sense of solidarity. The international community can really help, and the United States has provided millions of dollars recently, and the European Union actually, to help deal with IDPs, and that's right and just that they're doing that. In terms of providing research on the Western parts, well, that's one of the things that I sort of hinted at earlier, is that you will have very, very implacable attitudes towards territory from places that are really far away from those contested territories. And I think we're seeing that with Crimea. Crimea becomes a sort of symbol of victimhood, and therefore it has to be taken back by Ukraine. And yet some of those people may not, you know, live in any way close to Crimea, may have never been to Crimea, and so on and so forth. Whereas if you go closer to it, then you get different attitudes. And, you know, they're not necessarily saying we don't know what those attitudes are, but that's what we've seen in the past before the war. And that's one of the things that I think is worth paying attention to. We would like to have some funds to be able to scale this up to other places, and we'll see if we can secure those later.
Yeah, it also would absolutely agree. I just only wanted to stress that exactly Poltava, it's very interesting, as you mentioned, because Poltava was the only part where local residents didn't have a high level of agreements that they're affected by the war. It was only Dnipro, Zaporizhia. So what we see through the sample, again, it's just distributive analysis. We've done some statistical analysis, but we want double check. We're running multiple regressions and dealing with missing data, so we don't want to share it yet. But what we found, definitely very strong difference in Poltava. So it's again supporting our hypothesis that war experience matter, how people want to see the future, how they support peace processes in this thing.
Can I just make a note on that? During the time the research was being conducted, Dnipro and Zaporizhia were both rocketed, and there were people that died in those cities during that time, and there were air raid warnings all the time. I think there were also air raid warnings in Poltava, but from what I know, I don't think there were any rockets. So that is just an important contextual detail.
Okay, great. And so we have two more questions. So we have that are both in the chat. So we have one from Susan again. So she's asking about how the war has affected individuals into personal conflicts. So how, in other words, how has the war shaped interpersonal relationships or conflicts, including how families have the experiences of families split by the war? And the second question is from Sarah, where she's asking about how do we predict Ukraine's recent surge in the East to affect our research, and what are the policy implications therein? Do either of you want to take that one? Either of those?
We didn't, Susan, assess directly in the interpersonal relations, but again, based on our questions about losing a family member, losing a friend or neighbor, it's clearly people affected. And what we again found, it's preliminary. I don't even want to state that it's finding, but preliminary analysis that people, those who lost loved ones, actually were more in support for freeing all territories against peace. And it's if you look into theories of Anatole France and others, that's meaning making, those who lost the loved ones usually the ones who need to make meaning for this, and peace is not the meaning they are looking yet. So they're more in support for territorial integrity because they have to know that their loved one didn't die in vain. So, but again, it's preliminary research, which we didn't want to state as a final data before we found it. And on prediction, so we do not really predict, but we clearly can see what that the divisions which we found within dilemma probably will increase, because I just saw a very interesting interview conducted by Wall Street Journal in recently liberated Zoom, where a woman is telling, we don't have gas, we don't have electricity, we don't have water, so many people died, I just want peace. But then another interview at the same time telling, no, we need to fight now, when we're liberated, we need to continue. So I believe, based on what we will see, it's that the division within those who are strongly affected by violence and those who are not will increase. At least this is how I see that.
Yeah, on that issue, I want to bring in some earlier research that I was involved in with Dr. John O'Loughlin and Gwendolyn Sass of ZOAS in Berlin. And that was in the Donbass. And one of the findings there was that majorities on both sides of the divide in the Donbass, pre-war Donbass, agreed with what we call the Victoria question, which is that you know, it essentially was a statement. All I want is a good job and then a good pension. It doesn't matter what flag, what country I live in. And so majority supported that, which indicated that people had a sort of public goods conception of the state. They have loyalty to the state when the state provides. And this is relevant because in situations of devastation, which we're now seeing in the East, where territories have been reclaimed. Well, first of all, Russia's liberation of these territories was a disaster, is seen as a disaster, was effectively looting, as well as war crimes being committed, some horrific you know, brutalization of the population that were left there. And that was only a small portion of the overall population. And then only a small portion of those collaborated with the Russians. Now, it means it is extremely important for Ukraine, the Ukrainian state, to be able to go into those areas and bring reconstruction right away in order to deliver for the population, you know, just in a humanitarian way. There's a massive need in these areas. So that's a policy implication for the research. We did ask about discrimination and whether IDPs felt they were discriminated, and the results show that IDPs did not perceive that they were discriminated. So that's the sort of getting at the interpersonal, potential interpersonal dimension of it. But I do think Karina's argument more generally about those that are war affected being quite different from those who are not is something to watch. And then, of course, war experience is very different, because being displaced is different from having lost someone. And then that someone being a soldier versus someone being, you know, a civilian victim. All of these things are important differentiations that researchers need to pay attention to.
And I just probably want to add one more wider context for the whole analysis. As you saw, 60% of people, of those who we interviewed, do speak Russian at home. And it's completely dismissed the whole, destroy the whole argument of Russia and Russian leadership that they are to save Russian-speaking population. What we see is that it's specifically Russian-speaking population become a target of mass of bombing. Mariupol, it's Russian-speaking city. We still have a project, and State Department agreed to extend it, and we hope we will return back working in Kharkiv, Mariupol, and Kherson. All these three cities now, everyone knows now about all these three cities. And they all were Russian-speaking populations, but what we also see is a huge surge in perception that people feel Ukrainian citizens. This skyrocket, and which other research also show, very strong feeling of Ukrainian national identity at the same time. But again, what I wanted to show, the stress here, is that majority of people who are affected by the war are Russian-speaking population, which Putin claimed to save and support.
Okay, so we have two more questions here. So we have one from Naomi, who was asking about issues of basically questions around distance from the conflict and how that might affect people's propensity towards supporting peace. So she's asking if about diaspora populations and whether we think they would be less likely to desire peace than people who are not in the diaspora, people who live in Ukraine, but also in particular, do you think that people who are long-term diaspora members will be less likely to desire peace than more recently displaced people? And then we just now had another question come in from Jeff, who is asking, sorry, I haven't gotten to read it yet. Oh, he's asking about the role, the current role of people who have been involved in processes of dialogue and peace building in Ukraine. So basically, how is civil society or peace builders, how are they engaged in the current moment?
I can start answering and Gerard can jump in. So a lot of research on diaspora, there are a huge amount of research on diaspora, show that diaspora are usually more justice oriented than peace oriented. Then we have this tension between achieving justice and put everyone in responsible and bring a victory versus peace. It's clear there are a lot of research which show diaspora are less peace oriented in this way. And Gerald definitely have more insights from political geography on the question regarding, the question on dialogue. So we actually having another session on Friday where three of my colleagues just conducted analysis of ongoing civic society initiatives. So we will be presenting the report. So it will be more coming up. And of course, in situation of this, where both dilemmas are functioning very profoundly within people and also more orientation on military victory, we can see some spaces where speaking about peace might become problematic because peace perceived as pacifistic term. I think it's more meaning, problems with the meaning of peace, which people do not really see that peace can be a very strong political process which bring victory to Ukraine. But again, to come Friday for the session where we will be discussing this report.
Yeah, in terms of the question concerning distance and diasporas, well, I think there's the literature on diasporas is enormous, but there certainly is a long tradition of diasporas holding conceptions of the territory which are more hardline, more uncompromising than those of people actually living in the territory. And that's certainly true in the Irish case. It's true in Croatia also. So therefore, I would assume that that's one thing that is worthy of research. The research that my colleagues and I have conducted elsewhere on attitudes, geopolitical attitudes, show very clear divides between East and West. And the Russian-speaking population generally has had a very distinctive attitude towards geopolitical questions, which is different from that of the West. argument that is now made following various polls that have done by the International Republican Institute and Olga Onich and Henry Hale have done great work on this too. Their argument is that there's been a profound shift in attitudes towards NATO, towards the European Union amongst people in the Southeast, and that is, and some of that actually happened before the war. It happened from 2014 onwards. And of course, then what follows on from that is the sense that, and it's true in certain polls, that there's this perception of national unity that, what one poll by ratings had it that 98% of the population polled believed in Ukrainian victory. As someone who has done this for quite a while, I am actually somewhat skeptical of that unity. I think the divides are still significant. I think the needs of the Russian-speaking population and their attitudes are still significant. And I say that because we have data which we haven't shown you here, on, for example, issues that we have studied in the past. So we asked a question, should all Lenin statues be torn down? And that's a question we've asked in the past, and from 2014, and the majority of the population say no. It said no in 2014 in the Southeast. We asked that question again in this survey, and there are more people say yes, but it's actually not a majority. It's divided. So in terms of the sort of vision that some Ukrainians have, which is that this is decolonization and this is a de-Sovietization is required here of Ukraine, that particular attitude is going to alienate a certain portion of the population. They're not there yet in terms of buying into that particular vision. You know, understandable that though it is from the perspective of you know, Ukrainian history, but it's everyday life. That is one indication as to the fact that these differences are still there and still important. And I think it would be a mistake for policymakers to assume that everyone wants NATO in the Southeast now. I think that this is a part of a reaction to this particular invasion.
I actually want to thank you, Jad. Also add to this that research in Georgia, for example, Susan, you will sharing dissertation and also speaking to Natia about it, and other places shows that there is a strong homogenization of society in situation of war and threat. And this homogenization silence alternative voices, but not only voices, but also alternative cultures and linguistic spaces. And exactly, I completely agree with Jad. This is very important for going forward for Ukraine to preserve multiplicity of different groups of different cultural spaces, because there are a lot of them even in Western Ukraine. We have different small ethnic groups, and I think what is encouraging in these situations, and when we ask people, but again we ask people in the Eastern Ukraine, what is meaning of their identity? Again, it's preliminary results, but overwhelmingly we saw that they select civic meaning of national identity instead of ethnic. And this is very encouraging. So, but this was as important as a recommendation for political leaders and for recommendation for international community to keep the civic meaning as the key, not ethnic, not others, but the civic meaning of national identities. And it doesn't matter what your ethnicity, what your language, what religion, we all perceive together as a citizen of Ukraine.
Right, so we have 5 minutes left. I don't see any other questions. Does anyone else have any other questions they'd like to raise? Well,
Mike or Emina, maybe you want to like, we want to give you opportunity also maybe to, if you have an idea, answering of any of this question.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of ideas, but I mean, I've been mostly really digging deeply on the statistical analysis from in terms of my most recent role in the project, and it's, you know, as we talked about before, this is really ongoing, and so we can't talk a lot about the findings, but the finding that I did really find interesting when I was doing these analyses was that the experience of losing somebody, not being injured yourself, but the experience of losing someone close to you, actually made people have more. The sense I got from the data was basically that these people want revenge. They want to win. They don't want to give up. They want to win the war, to maybe avenge, right, this loss that they have, because, and likely there's emotion going on there. And we have measures on emotions, right, but we haven't looked into those yet. But I think that's a really important finding, and obviously gets directly to some of our research questions. So I'm really looking forward to us exploring that more, because it seems like a very theoretically and practically important question. Yes.
So I saw Susan ask us about the next steps, and next step will be we will be doing some questions and running some focus groups, maybe first among refugees, because I'm not going to Ukraine for right now, and then we will do the same in Ukraine and run pilot focus groups. And then we have a partner, Kharkiv University, who will be Institute of Sociology, who work with us on multiple previous projects, who will be conducting focus groups. So we'll be getting more information and then unite it to the survey. And when we hope to write, and we then hope to get another project now to do also include Western Ukraine. Emina, I see you.
Okay. Karina, could I ask one question?
Sure.
I'm interested in the reaction that people had to this whole idea of compensation, and as opposed to an apology. And it seems to be completely different from the idea of one of the other questions that you asked. So did you have any clue as to what kind of compensation would be acceptable to IDPs and people who are peripherally affected by the bombing and the rocketing? What would they regard as being sufficient?
Gerard,
Yeah.
do you want to?
We don't know. We did actually have a question, which is a particular number associated with it. What was, I think, 1 billion or 1 million per year or something like that. I think it was 1 billion per year. So it was essentially a question designed to sort of see if this sacred value, that asking that question and just putting a price on something would trigger this sense of sacred value, and of course it did. So that sort of underscored what was important about this, which is, making peace here is going to be extremely difficult, and compensation and how that is configured within a larger package of a settlement is it just, how that's going to happen, I don't know, but certainly that is something that needs a lot of research. Let me end on just one note, which is that I really want Ukraine to avoid the fate of Ireland, which is that, and it's 100 years ago since Ireland signed a peace treaty with Britain, which led to the creation of the independent Republic of Ireland. And there were certain territories, Northern Ireland, that were not part of that. It was a division in the country. One of the consequences immediately after signing that treaty was a civil war in Ireland. We have to be aware of the fact that there's potential for that here, and that right now a lot of things are covered up by slogans of victory and moving on to victory. Well, what does that mean in terms of Crimea? And the millions of people who see themselves as Russian but are living on internationally recognized territory of Ukraine right now. Those are huge issues. And this, then, if those are excluded and are part of considered part of Russia, then is there going to be an irredentist, a very strong irredentist feeling amongst a significant portion of the Ukrainian population that these are lost territories and that we need to engage in what the IRA did, which was a guerrilla war, in order to try to take them back. These are, this is only the beginning, and it's an extremely difficult and infuriating and awful, ugly conflict.
Okay, thank you very much. We unfortunately need to finish, but stay tuned. We just started. What you saw is just very 5% of the iceberg which we are digging in, and we will be happy to share with you results, and we hope next meeting will be then Ukraine will achieve peace. But with hope note. Thank you. Bye bye.